Welcome to the inaugural session of the Learning, Equity, and Power, or LEAP series, presented by the Center for the Study of Social Policy. My name is Anand Sharma, and I'm a Senior Associate at CSSP, and I'll be your host for this session. Before we jump into the conversation we have planned, I wanted to share a bit about CSSP and the LEAP initiative. For those that don't know, CSSP is a national nonprofit that works to achieve a racially, economically, and socially just society in which all children and families thrive. To do this, we promote public policies grounded in equity, support strong and inclusive communities, and advocate with and for all children and families marginalized by public policies and institutional practices. We seek to transform ideas into action, and LEAP is a new initiative to help us do just that. During the session and throughout the series, we'll be highlighting and encouraging learning about what it takes to advance equity and power in communities, and we hope that you'll join us, contribute your experience and expertise, and think about how these lessons might help you more powerfully advance equity in the communities that you care about and serve. Given CSSP's longstanding commitment to supporting community, policy, and systems change, we couldn't be more thrilled to kick off our LEAP series with today's session, how funders can help build community power, lessons from the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities initiative. CSSP has had the pleasure of being one of TCE's learning partners over the past few years, and we're excited to share some of the insights we and other learning evaluation partners have discovered with TCE and its many stakeholders in communities across California. We are very fortunate to be joined by three wonderful guests who can help offer an entree to the large collection of research and learning, drawing on TCE's past decade of work through building healthy communities. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Sandra Witt, who serves as TCE's Managing Director, Program and Partnership, Power Infrastructure Statewide. Sandra, welcome to the LEAP Lab. You are our first guest. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much. It's really, really great to be in this space with you, Anand and Julia and Gigi and everybody else. And it's really great to see faces. So happy to be here.
It is our pleasure, I assure you. So first off, just for folks that don't know, could you share a little bit about the California Endowment and its mission?
Yeah, so the California Endowment is a private statewide foundation. It's a conversion foundation. I noticed that there were some conversion foundations in this space. And our mission is to expand access to affordable, quality healthcare for underserved communities and to promote fundamental improvements in the health status of all Californians. So this mission really is in service of creating a vision for a healthy California for all, where everyone belongs and everyone is healthy.
I know that over the past 10 years, you've done a lot of work with your colleagues and many partners under the banner of building healthy communities. And I was wondering if you could share for folks who might not be familiar, how did you arrive at the BHC approach and what are some of the core components of that?
So building healthy communities is a 10-year, very bold, ambitious, billion-dollar initiative designed to promote healthy communities for all by really building the power and voice of the communities that are most impacted by health inequities to advance policy and systems change for racial and health equity. So it's really a very, very big, ambitious plan. We have just completed the 10-year cycle on building healthy communities. It actually turns out that it was more like an investment of $1.75 billion when you add up all of the resources that went into this. And this includes deep investment and deep relationships with 14 communities that have been impacted by social and health inequities, along with a statewide policy and narrative change efforts. And I would say the core elements of building healthy communities are really around people power, what we call people power, really building the power and voice of the communities most impacted, as some of our community partner organizers talk about, people that are closest to the pain, and really resourcing that in a way where they can organize, participate, and shape the decisions that impact their everyday lives, and hold the systems accountable for those. And so I think over the course, I would say that, over the course of the initiative, our understanding of what it actually means to resource and support communities in this way to achieve health equity has gotten even stronger, and has become so much more important for the work going forward. as we're supporting groups to organize around issues that they care about, TCE also created sort of a broad framework, and actually, long story, multiple frameworks, but really kind of provided some frameworks and outcomes that we thought were important for communities to work on. And then the 14 communities then identified and prioritized those issues that they wanted to work on and create campaigns around. And I would just say that those are organized around health happens with prevention, which is primarily more access to healthcare. Health happens in neighborhoods, issues around the built environment, community safety, et cetera. And then health happens in schools as sort of the broad issues that communities worked on. And over the course of the 10 years, there have been many, many policy wins. I think at this point, it's something like over 1,500 policy wins over the course of that time. I think the other thing I would say that I think is a core element of BHC is really how the foundation organized itself. The role of program officers, particularly our place program officers in the 14 communities. So a program officer was actually embedded in each of those 14 communities. And I bring that up as an important part of our learning and the model because it really did and has created a different connection with the communities and the grantees that we have supported and come to know over the last 10 years.
There's definitely a lot more to say, and I'll just say if anyone who's tuning in, your eyes kind of glazed over when you heard over $1 billion, more like $1.75 billion. It's a lot of money, and it's great that kind of investment went toward health equity. But just want to be clear that there are lots of lessons that folks can draw, even if you're not funding at that particular level. So good for folks to know, but don't worry, there's a lot of insights that we think apply to funders of all different stripes and of all different kinds. And the other point that I would just make is that obviously there's a huge interest, given that TC is a health conversion foundation, in health equity, but that was very broadly defined. And we think that there's a lot of different lessons as people dig into the research, as we hope you do, to learn from different cases on lots of different issue areas. And again, just lots of insights that would cut across issue areas. So just hope that folks will continue to dig deeper and get beyond just that very quick thumbnail sketch that Sandra helped to draw. Sandra, before we introduce our next guest, I really wanted to just give you a chance to say up front, what's one of the biggest lessons or insights that you've drawn from the past 10 years of work? And I know that's a tough question because it's 10 years and there's lots of lessons and insights, but if there was one thing that you really wanted to make sure that folks kept in their minds as we entered this conversation, what would that be?
I think that the main thing, and I'm going to kind of wrap up three things in this, is that we've really moved from thinking about power and supporting organizing as a means to a policy win, as a means to a campaign, to really thinking about the building of power as an end in and of itself. And so really moving from a specific policy win or supporting groups to do policy and systems transformation, to really thinking about how is it that you'll actually build power and recognizing that really power, and we're a health conversion foundation, so really seeing power or lack of power as a key determinant of health equity, in addition to all the other things that we know impact health, like actually communities not having power impacts health outcomes, both at an individual level and at a community level. So I think that has been a really, really important switch, which then if we're thinking about not just funding towards a particular policy win, really thinking about like what's the infrastructure and the capacities that are needed long-term to really support the kind of transformation that we are envisioning. If we're really thinking about the big things of dismantling white supremacy and achieving racial and health equity for everybody, right? So I think that has been a real switch in our thinking. And I think related to that is this concept that you'll be hearing more about, but this concept of a powered ecosystem, that while it's incredibly important to resource the organizing groups, the grassroots, the base building groups to build their capacity and their power and their voice, that it's also important that that alone will not get us to the big structural changes that we want to see. And really, we're influenced by Jennifer Ito's work with the USC, University of Southern California research, what is it called? Equity Research Institute, which kind of laid out for us conceptually this map of thinking about like how we begin thinking about the power ecosystem, and Gigi has helped advance that or think about that as well going forward. And you'll be hearing more about that. But really understanding that, I think like that piece around it's not just enough we need to fund organizing really in ways that really support the field for long-term change, not just for a particular campaign. And that really need to think about it within the context of a broader ecosystem, power ecosystem, so that the things that we're helping to support, the other research, the other organizations are really in service of the people that are most impacted, who are at the center of the power ecosystem. And then really organizing and really broadening and thinking, and our partners really called us on this, like, how is it that you're really centering racial equity in this?
Thank you, Sandra. You've done a wonderful job. No, those are all great, and you've done a wonderful job laying out some of the big issues and elements of the strategy. And I think folks are definitely interested in the role of the foundation and what that means for program officers. So we'll come back to that in a little bit, because I know it's a question that you all have thought a lot about over the past 10 years, and as you think about your work going forward. But before we do that, I wanted to bring in our next guest. We are very excited to have Gigi Barton, who is the founder and principal of Barsoom Policy Consulting. And Gigi is a person with a lot of experience in both in philanthropy and research and evaluation. And she is one of the many, many learning and evaluation partners that has been on this learning journey. So Gigi, welcome to the First Leap Lab.
Thank you, Anand.
So Sandra teed up this idea of power building and said a little bit about that, but I know that that's a term that organizing and power building people are increasingly using and talking about. But can you help us understand, how do you think about power building, and how do you kind of unpack that concept and that process?
How I unpacked the whole concept around power and power building was actually in partnership, and when I had the opportunity to evaluate a group of grassroots organizing groups and the electoral campaigns that they implemented around progressive district attorneys in several cities. And the framework that I developed really emerged from that work, and understanding how they approached these campaigns and how they were using them as not just a means to get progressive DAs elected, but as a means to build power. And as Sandra was saying, that within this conceptualization, then power is both a means to advance progressive policy goals, as well as an ends, that it's something that groups are building through their advocacy work. So the conceptualization of power here is really grounded in communities, and those communities in particular who are impacted by inequities. And what the framework tries to describe is how, as Sandra was talking about, that organizations don't do this work alone, but they do it as an ecosystem. And this ecosystem that builds power must and does center communities. And in order for communities to be centered, grassroots organizing groups become very important because of the role they play in terms of both engaging, building the leadership, and mobilizing communities on the issues that they have prioritized. So this ecosystem, which is described here in the framework as the building power component, is really characterized by the relationships among the groups, the array of and diversity of groups in the ecosystem, the shared vision and analysis that help them to align on areas of interest, the infrastructure in the ecosystem that facilitates their coordination and collaboration, and the capacities that are needed in the ecosystem. So as Sandra was saying about the peer power flower, this conceptualization of the ecosystem builds on that and moves beyond just the typologies of organizations in the ecosystem to really focus on the capacities that are needed to build power. And that includes organizing, obviously, which is the most important, but also advocacy capacities, electoral and civic engagement capacities, governing capacity, narrative change capacity, adaptive capacity of an ecosystem, as well as developmental capacities, and developmental both for organizations in the ecosystem as well as individuals. So what the framework then tries to show is how these ecosystems then wield their collective capacities and strategies to exercise their power in what often grassroots organizing groups describe as campaigns. These campaigns can be policy change efforts, they can be electoral efforts, they can be monitoring and implementation efforts, whatever the social change strategy is, that is then captured within exercising power. Having power, which is the third component of this cyclical process, are the outcomes. It's, as Sandra was talking about, those 1,500 plus wins, but it's also losses, because power can also be built through losses. So it's the policy change wins, it's the electoral wins and losses. It's also shifts in politics and also changes in the community level. But the framework, I think the most unique aspect of it, it doesn't stop there. What it attempts to do is move beyond these wins and look at how power shifted and changed and increased. And that's the portion of the framework that's described as expanding power. And how the framework does this is it looks at changes in power, both in terms of what the literature describes as both hidden power, which I describe as capacities, and the visible power, which I describe as the influence of organizations. And it looks at this on 4 levels. The individual level, because in grassroots organizing, individuals are central to building power. How they are transformed into leaders who then have influence. And that influence can be manifest, either they may run for office or they're in positions of influence, sitting at tables of decision makers, or being perceived as influential by decision makers. It also looks at both hidden and visible power on the organizational and the ecosystem level. So, for example, changes in capacity, both on the organization and ecosystem level, new organizations that come into the ecosystem, increased relationships, strength of relationships, new capacities of the ecosystem. And then in terms of looking at their influence, how are they perceived by decision makers? Are they perceived as a collective force? Something that decision makers need to look at in terms of their calculus, in terms of their influence, and whether they need to ally with these entities or see them as a threat. And then finally, the last level that the framework looks at to assess changes in power are geographic. And that's because within organizing, as you're probably all familiar, organizers build power and organize communities door to door, community by community, region by region. And so as their base expands regionally, that is also a shift and a change in power that extends across regions and extends across states. But what the power framework also then tries to show is it doesn't end there. All of that power that is built through each of these campaigns is then leveraged in the next cycle, the next policy goal, the next effort to monitor a policy that's just been passed. So it's this constant cyclical process that happens over time, where organizations and ecosystems engage in campaigns, build power, and continue to leverage it to achieve their longer-term transformative goal. And I'll just give you a real-world example that we've just experienced here in California. So many of you know about the recall election that just happened in California that was soundly dismissed. And that was because of the work of these organizing groups across the state that have been funded over the last decade to create this strong network of organizing groups that are working on electoral policy and efforts to create change. And this statewide network of organizations mobilized communities of color against this this campaign to recall the governor. And this work has been happening over the last decade and is also grounded in the BHC work, because this is part of what the endowment has been funding in terms of an ecosystem across the state and for the last decade that also connected to the BHC sites to help build their electoral capacity and overlay electoral organizing into their grassroots organizing efforts. And as a result, that's what actually helped to create the ability of the state to actually defeat this ballot measure. And what's interesting about that, and again, you see the cyclical process of wielding power, the same night we knew the results of the election, organizing groups and advocacy groups already were pushing on the governor to sign policies that they had been advancing related to criminal justice and reproductive justice reforms. So you can see how they wielded the power that they were able to build through this campaign to continue to advance their policy goals. So it's all connected and it's all part of the cyclical process.
And I think it helps to give folks a more nuanced way of thinking about power and the different ecosystem players and capacities. So it's really, really helpful. We want to invite to our last guest for this conversation, Julia Coffin, to join this discussion about lessons from BHC. And Julia Coffin is the co-director and founder of the Center for Evaluation Innovation and so many other things. But she has been one of the wonderful partners we at CSSP have had the pleasure of working with. And she has really looked at advocacy throughout the BHC experience. So I wanted to just start by asking you, how do funders in your experience and research tend to approach advocacy, and kind of how did that approach evolve over the course of BHC?
As you just said, we at CEI, in collaboration with Gigi, looked at the role of advocacy in BHC and what it really means for advocacy to build power. And I'm a longtime advocacy evaluator, and this was a pretty transformative experience for me in thinking about, what success looks like for advocacy. So quickly, just to be clear about my use of terms and what I mean by advocacy, I'm using it to mean the sustained actions taken to achieve policy wins or systems changes. So using it synonymously with campaigns. And that's different from, what we mean by organizing and grassroots organizing, and which has as its central purpose the building of power. But my main point here today that I want to lead with is that foundations don't have to just fund organizing in order to build power. Sandra mentioned that, and I want to emphasize that advocacy and campaigns that are designed to achieve specific wins can also build power as long as communities are centered in the work. So in my experience with advocacy funders, foundations that support advocacy historically have measured success by whether that win or that systems change has been achieved. Did the campaign succeed in passing a new policy? Was a program, was the campaign successful in getting a program funded? And those are important goals for sure. But when the singular focus is just on what it takes to win, that approach comes up short for a number of reasons. One of which, of course, is that wins are vulnerable. They often come under attack when the political climate changes, et cetera. But and so they're under threat unless there can be a sustained effort or constituency in place to protect the wind, as Gigi was just talking about in California with the growth of that ecosystem. But this approach also comes up short for foundations that care about advancing racial equity and justice with their grant making. So if advancing equity is the goal, then how we think about the success of advocacy also has to pay attention to what was won. Does the win help to address racial disparities and their root causes, as well as how it was won? Were communities impacted by the problem involved and centered in that work involved and centered in the advocacy effort. So it's not just did the win happen, but what did the win look like and how did you get to that win? And then ultimately, the ultimate measure of success for advocacy is whether power was built as a result, whether there was a win or, as Gigi just said, whether there was a loss, was power built? And for BHC, that shift toward thinking about power as the ultimate goal happened midpoint through the initiative. They literally called it a pivot to power. There's a publication that has that title. When people power came to be considered, it was initially considered a driver of policy and systems change, and then it became the change itself that BHC sought to achieve. This table up here that you see on the screen is in our evaluation report, and it is just an attempt to be clearer about what is different about advocacy just designed to achieve a win versus advocacy that is designed to win and achieve power. And just a couple of examples there, that the policy solution, if you're just focused on a win, may or may not be informed by impacted communities, whereas if advocacy is designed to build power, it is developed or informed by impacted communities. And just one more, that advocacy strategy, if you're just thinking about a win, the strategy is really focused on an analysis of the political opportunity and politics versus with power, strategy is based on a shared analysis that's grounded in a consideration of root causes and of inequities.
And I want to invite Sandra and Gigi back into the conversation. And I think Sandra, I'd love to start with you in terms of the way that this work has changed over the past 10 years. And as Julie and Gigi have talked about, this isn't necessarily the way that foundations operate. Even TCE went through some dramatic changes in its view of this work and its philanthropic practice. And would love for you to share a little bit about the role of the program officer. Folks may be interested to hear a little bit more about what that means to have been embedded in the course of BHC. And I know you all are thinking about what are the implications of viewing power versus, just wins. It's wins and power, I should say, as kind of the thing that you're after. What are the implications of that for the way that you think about strategy and organize yourselves as a foundation going forward?
I'll say a little bit about the role of the foundation and the program managers. I think, like many foundations, TCE has always wanted to listen and to the perspectives of communities as it's developed its programming we're now celebrating, I think, 25 years of being in existence. And so I think there's always been this orientation to listen, to engage and get community input. But I think in building healthy communities, there was a real change in what that actually really meant. And this notion of having a program manager assigned to a particular geographic location, a place, one of those 14 places, many times being part of that community, living in that community, for most of them, others assigned, living close by, but really responsible for thinking about how is it that the foundation would be responsive to the priorities that are emerging in those places in terms of really impacting sort of the social economic conditions that impact poor health outcomes, and what was needed. And that process, I think, really created a level of connection, a level of accountability that was really important for us as we, and really helped us as a foundation actually change and shift and adjust and learn through that process. I don't know. So I think the connection and the relationships that have been, both because you're really connected and proximate, as we say sometimes, to the communities, as well as the long-term commitment to that relationship and the struggles of what that actually really means. This work is, as you can, there's a lot of power dynamics in this work. It's not easy, it's messy, but the long-term commitment to be in that relationship and figure out what's really needed and how we as a foundation can be more responsive, sometimes even real time, I think is something that has been really important for us as we've sort of been really thinking about how do we do this work. And so now, so the role of the program manager, I think, was really connected to that, and our commitment and our learning that we actually had to be in much more real relationships. And what did that mean for us in terms of the power that we bring to that relationship? I think that, so I think that's the piece that I just want to highlight here. Now, it's not possible to always do that. There's other ways to make sure that the connection with our partners is front and center. But I think that this notion of really being able to real time listen to what the issues are, the struggles, adapt, figure out how to best support that ecosystem, because each site is an ecosystem as well, right? So thinking about how you help support the efforts of the groups is a piece of it. And I think that has really, and why I'm highlighting this is really important, because I also think that has helped us really do a couple of things. One is really look internally around, it's not just enough to be thinking about how we promote equity, how we think about structural racism, how that plays out in our communities, but it's also important to really think about we as institutions, how we are operating and how we may unintentionally be perpetuating some of the inequities. And so that requires a real looking internally and building our own skills and capacities and understandings around structural racism, around how that impacts the work that we're doing, how we yield power or not, how we share power, how we shift our power, and then how we actually think about our policies and practices and how those either help facilitate the work of our partners or actually make it more difficult. And so I think that piece that has really led to a very intentional focus from our board and our leadership to really think about how we become an anti-racist institution, as well as, thinking about trust-based philanthropy and what does that actually mean to operationalize and embody that practice. And so we're in the middle of all this. We do not have all the answers. This is a long-term journey, but I think that BHC has been a gift to the foundation as well, because it has forced us to really kind of look internally and think about how it is that we can shift power in different ways.
I appreciate that, Sandra, and I appreciate you talking about things you're still grappling with and how messy this is, because when you're sharing lessons at the end of 10 years and after the graphic designers get a handle on all of the lessons, everything looks super neat and oh yeah, we just had the table, look at figure 6B, that's what you do, that's how you figure it out. But there's a lot of hard-won experience and learning behind that, and that's exactly the kind of spirit of the conversation we're hoping to have in these Leap Lab sessions. So appreciate you just being open about that path. I wanted to bring in Gigi and Julia on this conversation about implications of this way of working, of focusing on power building for philanthropic strategy, and specifically something Sandra teed up, which is the what I know both of you have referred to as centering organizing, grassroots organizing groups. And Gigi, maybe if you want to jump in, your thoughts on that or anything else in this conversation about philanthropic strategy.
Just a couple of things I'd like to follow up on that Sandra mentioned. One, that messiness of this work. And I think that's because funders are part of the ecosystem. They are not outside of it, kind of pulling strings or deciding where to allocate resources in a vacuum, but they are part of the ecosystem, and that has implications for how they relate to organizations, the work they're doing, their knowledge of the ecosystem, how it's operating, what it's doing, what it's prioritizing, and what role the foundation can play as a result. And one of the things that we found in the evaluation of the BHC that's documented in both of the reports, in the 8 case studies that we did across the state, was that the foundation played variable roles under differing conditions. It was very fluid. And it's what I describe as a spectrum of directionality, as opposed to kind of this dichotomy of strategic and responsive. It's a spectrum in which the organization was much more top-down. The foundation could be much more top-down and directive depending on the conditions, or really took a backseat, just funded the work, supported the organizations, and took the lead of the organizations in the ecosystem. And it was very contextual. It depended on the readiness of the field. Did they have sufficient capacities? Were they able to act quickly enough depending on the policy window of opportunity? What were the conditions? And based on that, the foundation shifted and modified almost intuitively. And I think recognizing this and doing it more intentionally and gathering sufficient information to be more intentional around that can actually help funders in their work in terms of being a stronger ecosystem partner.
This experience taught me something really important about what foundation strategy means for foundations that are working on, as Sandra was describing, giving up power or shifting power to communities. And I think this is a question that's coming up for a number of foundations who are thinking about or starting to move more toward trust-based grant making. The question is, well, what if I'm not making strategy, then what am I doing? Or what does strategy mean for me? And so in the case of BHC, as you know, the communities were the strategists. They were identifying the goals and identifying how to get there. The foundation was an actor in that system, but you know, so strategy lived at that with communities. And so for the foundation, the strategy really became, how do I, as a program officer, support that power ecosystem to make sure that the actors in it who need to be in it are present, that the capacities exist, that I am making connections where I need to make connections, and all of that. And so that became the definition of what foundation strategy was, not the how do I get to that goal. I mean, there was a shared goal there.
You know, to the point that Anand made very early on, that sometimes the work of the endowment can be intimidating or off-putting to other funders because it's like a $1 billion investment. But I'd like to note that even within the Building Healthy Communities initiative, the endowment didn't do it alone, but they often did it in partnership with other funders, statewide, sometimes national funders, and definitely local family funders and community-based foundations were critical in that work regionally in supporting these ecosystems on a local and regional level. And even to the example that I used earlier in terms of the recall, this statewide network that's focused on electoral strategies was funded by a group of funders in California across the last decade. It wasn't just TCE, but it was that collective intentionality around building an ecosystem that was needed to build power. So that funder collaboration and funders seeing themselves as part of an ecosystem and how they need to work together towards that shared goal is also really important.
So before we close out, I wanted to give each of our guests a chance to just share any final thoughts and takeaways that they hope other funders will reflect on and keep in mind as they're trying to engage with the learnings from BHC and see what implications it might have for their own work. And I'll go in reverse order this time. I'd love to give Julia a chance to share any closing thoughts. And yeah, what's your advice to funders out there who may be listening?
Just to repeat my main point with a little more, which is that foundations don't just have to fund organizing in order to build power. So in that power building ecosystem, you have advocates, you've got researchers, you've got think tanks, you've got legal organizations, you've got lots of different kinds of actors. And so the question that you end up asking is, okay, well, what does it mean for researchers who study problems and develop policy recommendations to center communities? What does it mean for our communications consultants? What does it mean for evaluators like us to think about power as our goal and to center communities in the work? So that's my main takeaway.
Kind of my concluding reflection would be on taking the long view, that none of this work happens overnight, whether it's policy change or using policy change to build longer term infrastructure within an ecosystem that's lasting. So it's taking the long view, doing it with intentionality, and doing it consistently over time and in collaboration.
And Sandra will give you the final word.
Building healthy communities with this 10-year initiative, now we're moving into, we're transitioning into what we're calling Beyond 2020. And the big goal, and it really, I think, piggybacks very nicely with Julia and Gigi have said, the big goal that we have set out is California has a robust intergenerational power building ecosystem for advancing health justice and racial equity by 2030. So that is another big, huge, ambitious goal. And I think that really thinking about how we actually can better support the power ecosystem, really teasing out the capacities, the infrastructure that's needed, but doing it with our partners so that they are the ones that are really helping leading this work in terms of identifying what exactly is needed and what works. That's a lot of the work ahead, and just would really appreciate and look forward to working, continuing to work with many of you, but also additional funders around how we grapple with some of those big questions to really create the transformational change that we all want to see.
Thank you, Sandra. And I just wanted to note that there are a huge set of resources and reports that draw on lessons from BHC. There were a couple that were mentioned here, and if folks are really curious, Julia mentioned Advocacy That Builds Power. That's a report that she and a whole lot of other people that I won't have time to mention completed. And there was a companion report that Gigi was drawing a lot of lessons and remarks from, An Ecosystem to Build Power and Advance Health and Racial Equity. So we hope folks check those out, along with a whole bunch of other resources that we hope to share with you throughout this series. So I want to thank Julia, Sandra, and Gigi for sharing their insights and their time in this launch to our LEAP Lab series. I want to thank the California Endowment for allowing us to be a learning partner and for allowing us to give this platform to dig into these really difficult questions around what it takes to learn from, build equity, and power in communities. And most of all, I want to thank everyone that tuned in. This is just the first of many LEAP series, and we hope that you'll check out future ones so that you can learn more from the experience of building healthy communities.